Japanese firms and households grind to a halt as authorities work to restore power, water and communications.
Here in Japan, the lights go out in the country's first major blackouts for half a century.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Asia Business Report. I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore.
And I'm Marika Oi in Tokyo. Well, as you've been hearing, Japan was hit by the biggest earthquake ever recorded in its history. Power plants, refineries, ports and pipelines are all damaged, crippling much of the country's infrastructure. Here in Tokyo, there was relatively little damage, but further north, it was a different story.
Fires burning out of control at an oil refinery near Sendai. The quake affected pipelines along the northeast coast. Authorities still aren't clear as to the full extent of the damage. Some ports remain closed. Deliveries of crude and LNG delayed. Everyone's worst nightmare, the first ever blast at a nuclear power plant in Japan. The failure of the cooling systems initiated a meltdown. Nuclear power is the biggest source of energy in Japan. It accounts for 29% of national supply, along with liquefied natural gas. Coal powers a quarter of the national grid. Oil and hydroelectric power make up a much smaller share. The aftermath of the quake has depleted the national power supply. Over the weekend, Tokyo Electric called for rolling blackouts for the first time since the end of the Second World War. This lift stopped working soon after the earthquake. Lots of people here and around Japan got stuck and were forced to take fire escapes. Right now, most lifts in Tokyo are working again. But the prospect of rolling blackouts means that people might have to get used to climbing stairs. "97 steps later, and this office is only on the 7th floor. In the city of skyscrapers like Tokyo, many people live and work in 30, 40, sometimes 50-story buildings.
I think we'll face food shortages. I am buying as much dry food as possible.
I haven't prepared much yet, but I hope it won't be a full blackout.
I have been unplugging all the appliances at home in order to save some energy.
Roppongi, famous for its bright lights, but soon they'll have to turn these neon signs off. And the Tokyo Tower, which normally illuminates the skyline, has been dimmed as a sign of respect to those who have lost their lives.
Late last night, Tokyo Electric announced its first rolling blackouts. Areas around Tokyo will soon experience power cuts. That means no traffic lights. It can also affect water and gas supplies. Many Japanese businesses will be affected by this. Companies like Sony, Toyota and Nissan have all announced their plans to suspend some of their operations. Earlier, I spoke to a senior executive of Nissan Motors and asked him what the impact would be.
Well, clearly it is going to affect operations. Obviously, as a corporation, we're in close contact with the government officials to understand when the rolling blackouts are starting, and that's allowing us somewhere to coordinate and to the level of the disruption that we have. So I think it's under good control, but obviously it is going to have an impact on us.
And what about the actual earthquake on Friday afternoon? How did they affect the operations?
Well, I mean, the earthquake itself, beyond shaking everybody up clearly, obviously had a more impact on our operations, particularly to the north. Also, there was some damage caused in some of the factories. Nothing too serious. Fortunately, and the most important thing is that nobody was seriously hurt, it seems. A few minor injuries. Beyond that, of course, we lost a lot of cars in the tsunami. Around 2,300 cars we believe were lost. And obviously some of the damage means that we're not starting operations today.
And would this have any impact on your production capacity?
Well, obviously it's going to have an impact on our capabilities. Some plants will start more quickly than others. We've stopped production as of today. We're taking the opportunity now to assess how affected each operation is. Frankly, it's extraordinarily complex. It's not just that our factories, it's also our suppliers. Obviously, some of the suppliers are even within the exclusion area for the nuclear plant issues. So we're assessing supplier by supplier what the supply chain is looking like. Some factories will start more quickly than others. Some will take a little while to come back online.
And do you have any ideas on how long this situation might last?
Truthfully, we're in groundbreaking territory. We don't know.
So it's likely to be some weeks, possibly months, before things improve for those Japanese companies. Now back to you in the studio.
Thanks very much for that, Mariko. Well, Japan's market, the Nikkei, will be opening very shortly for business. And I'm joined now by Arjuna Mahendran from HSBC Private Bank. Now, obviously, it seems far too soon to be talking about the economic impact after a vast tragedy of this scale. But of course, Japan is Asia's second largest economy, and anything that happens there has repercussions throughout Asia. So how are we expected to see markets trading this week?
Well, the initial reaction is going to be a knee-jerk sell-off, but I don't think it's going to be extremely deep. I would reckon that we'd probably maximum be 5% below where we are when this thing, when the whole sell-off is over, which should take place fairly quickly. And that would mainly be insurance companies and such like who are directly affected by this tragedy. But I think in the longer term, the outlook is generally good after events like this. It does mobilize all sorts of resources into reconstruction, which has benefited the economy in the past, not just in Japan, but in lots of other earthquake and tsunami affected areas. And I don't think this is going to be any different. So in fact, I think at the end of the year, we will probably end up with the Japanese economy growing overall at about 1%. Which is quite fairly decent going, given that the economy has been in a near recession situation for many months last year. And looking forward, I think the Japanese corporate sector is fairly lean and mean at this point. It's quite different to the 90s when you had the Kobe earthquake, when there was a lot of froth in the market and companies had taken on too much in terms of assets, etc. Right now, Japanese companies are actually extremely profitable. Their return on assets is very good, and a lot of foreign institutional buyers have been investing in the Tokyo market over the last year in anticipation of these stronger profits continuing their momentum.
Well, let's take a look at that, because during Kobe, you only had about 29% of the market at that time of foreign owners. Now, of course, it's about 60% of foreigners into the Japanese market. So how are they expected to react?
Well, I would argue that that 60% comprises largely institutional investors who are pretty savvy. They know their valuations. They're not going to sell off in panic. These are long-term investors who are looking for intrinsic value in companies, and they found it in Japan. And that's the reason why I expect that if there's any knee-jerk sell-off, it's not going to be very deep.
Now, the Bank of Japan is holding its usual policy meeting today. They want to essentially ensure market stability. They've already extended some 55 billion yen over the weekend. But can Japan actually afford it? Because we know its public debt is about 200% of GDP.
That's right. Well, obviously, central bank accommodation is slightly different in that it doesn't come on the public debt numbers. It's just pure creation of money. And the Bank of Japan has been doing this for many months now. And I expect them to continue to do this, and they will probably announce continuation of these loans to other banks to continue the reconstruction lending unabated. So that, I think, is more or less baked in the cake. The issues really are for the longer term in terms of this huge overhang of public debt, which at some point is going to bite the government finances. But I think that's, again, not a short-term problem.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for that. Arjuna Mahendran, the Chief Asia Strategist for HSBC Private Bank. And that's it for this special edition of Asia Business Report. We'll have regular market updates on bbc.com/Asia Business.
We'll have the latest coverage from all the BBC correspondents around Japan at bbc.com/JapanQuake. But for now, thank you for joining us. This is Asia Business Report.
Well, let's just talk a bit about the planning for how to get back on its feet for Japan. Earlier I spoke to Roger Yates, the head of disaster management for the charity Plan International. He's been involved in several disaster reconstruction efforts and says Japan has a good chance of recovery.
For a country such as Japan, with the infrastructure, with the experience and with the money, the prospects of completing a recovery are obviously much, much, much better. If the tsunami had, and luckily it didn't, but if it had really had a bad effect, say in Philippines or Indonesia, then the capacity of the government to cope with that was much, much less, and it would be much more difficult for people to be able to afford to recover. As simple as that. They don't have the assets.
Yeah, as you speak, Roger, we're looking at pictures of the utter devastation. I mean, it's almost strange to think about how long it may take for a country to get back to normal that's been through something like this.
Yes, and it always takes longer than anyone thinks and much longer than the attention of the TV crews to get the full recovery. But at the same time, you have hundreds of thousands of people, if you work it right, who are all doing their level best to get things cleared up. So even in a household that somebody picks up a broom and starts to clear up the floor, that's happening all over the place, that lots of people are doing little things, and there's thousands of small stories of recovery going on. And we have to look at creating a space where all of those efforts start to work in harmony, and you really get progress then.
Roger Yates from Plan International.
Hello and welcome to Asia Today. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore. On this program,
dawn has broken in Japan, where the search for thousands of tsunami victims is resuming. Food and water are running short. Huge numbers of survivors are in emergency shelters.
And fears of aftershocks. People have been warned to brace themselves over the next 72 hours. There are also continued fears over the cooling systems on nuclear plants damaged by the quake. Hundreds of thousands of residents have been evacuated. The Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan has called on his country to unite and rebuild as it struggles to cope with the devastation caused by Friday's earthquake and tsunami. He has also said the country is facing its worst crisis since the Second World War, and there are fears the death toll could reach tens of thousands. Earlier I spoke to my colleague Marika Oi in Tokyo.
So far, people seem to be quite satisfied with how the government is handling the situation. Prime Minister Naoto Kan flew to Fukushima on Saturday. This was before the explosion at one of the nuclear reactors in Fukushima, but he visited some of the people who were affected by the earthquake. But there was some confusion over what was really happening at those nuclear power plants. Initially, the government said that there was no damage, and then we heard from them that there was a minor but not serious incident. And then on Saturday night, obviously, we saw that explosion. So that drew some criticism from the opposition party especially.
Right, and indeed, Mariko, in the past we've seen the government and the authorities haven't been quite so transparent about potential radiation leakage. Are they being seen to be doing a better job this time keeping the public informed?
Well, as you say, nuclear authorities here are known to be very tight with what kind of information that they release, for obvious reasons not to let people panic. But this is a similar scenario where people, particularly in Fukushima, where those nuclear plants are, they want to know exactly how dangerous this leak of radioactive material is, what is actually happening with other reactors. But so far, they haven't been able to get all the details. So that has been drawing some criticism as well.
Now let's move on to the politics, because Prime Minister Naoto Kan hasn't been a terribly popular Prime Minister. How's he being seen in handling all of this?
Well, as you say, only a few days ago he was fighting for his political life over a scandal, over a political donation by a non-Japanese resident, which is the same alleged violation which prompted his foreign minister, Mr. Maehara, to resign recently. But in a crisis like this, the opposition can't really be in opposition. They all have to unite together to make sure that people affected by this earthquake are getting exactly what they need. So it seems like his popularity at the moment is a lot better than a few days ago, but it is a long battle. There are a lot of challenges ahead, and it will depend on how he continues to handle the situation.
Mariko Oi there in Tokyo.